Happy Pride, readers. Welcome to Pride Book Fest. I'm Monse Castro. I go by she, her. And they told me to give y'all my credentials, but honestly, just always been a reader and I love to talk about books. I have a TikTok where I talk about books, Monse_reads. And I am so excited to bring you magical worlds, historical fantasies, and retellings, the new frontier of fantasy. Today, we're gonna talk about world building, story crafting, and just overall queerness in fantasy. So let's meet our panelists.
Hey y'all, I'm Kaylin Bayron. I'm the author of Cinderella is Dead and the upcoming This Poisoned Heart. I'm boring, so I'm not going to talk about myself. That's all you need to know. And my pronouns are she, her.
Hi, my name's Aidan Polydorus. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the author of The City Beautiful, a historical queer fantasy coming out on September 7th.
And I'm Aidan Thomas. I am the author of Cemetery Boys and Lost in the Neverwoods. My pronouns are he, they.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Tooley. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the author of Sweet and Bitter Magic and the forthcoming Sophie and the Bone Song in 2022.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's begin. I want to begin by talking about world building. Each of your books touches on a different aspect of the fantasy genre, from contemporary to high fantasy to historical fantasy to retellings. When you begin writing, how do you decide the landscape of your books, and what are the most important things that you write in order to build a believable world? How do you plan it out in the writing process? And let's begin with Kaylin.
Yeah, so for me, I usually get a pretty good feel for what the world will be, kind of what it'll look like, even before I get to the characters. So with Cinderella is Dead, I knew, it would be a world where the Cinderella story was real and the people who lived in this kind of society used it as like a guidebook for their lives. With This Poisoned Heart, it's a contemporary, and I really just wanted to evoke a kind of gothic atmosphere with the creepy house and the, small town where people kind of seem to know a secret that the main character hasn't quite found out about yet. It was more about the feeling, versus, the actual world that kind of came in a little bit later. But, the most important thing for me is kind of grounding the world in the thoughts and actions and emotions of the characters. You can have a book that kind of takes place wherever. If people aren't invested in the characters, I don't think it really matters that much. So, you can lay out all the politics and the magic systems and the history of a place, but I don't think that's quite as it's important, but people aren't going to care about it unless they care about the characters. So the world building for me is an ongoing kind of evolving process as I get to know these characters, because it usually takes me a full draft to really understand my characters and who they are. And so the world building comes in phases for me.
So for me, in terms of world building, it really depends on the genre and setting, I'd say. For The City Beautiful, it's set in Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair. So in the process of drafting it, I researched that time period extensively. Also because the mystery elements of the book are tied directly into the historical timeline. The timeline that occurs in the book is also very rigid. It occurs between the 4th of July and then the cold storage fire that occurs later in that same month. So it was important for me to structure the novel accordingly. I think in terms of writing historical fantasy, it's important to give a feeling of the time period and to avoid any anachronisms that may yank the reader out of the story. And for me, it was just really important to sort of build a structure where the timeline worked out and matched what was occurring throughout the book. And also, I really tried to draw upon the setting as well by mentioning the mentioning events that were occurring during that time, like the and that occurred before that time, such as the assassination attempt on Henry Frick, and also just the sort of political atmosphere in place in Chicago during that time, where the rise of anarchism and different political structures, and just the migration of immigrants there as well. So I think, to sum that up, it was really important for me to capture the political environment, and the setting, what was occurring during that time, and just finding a way to puzzle that into the story.
Gosh, for me, when it comes to world building, most people will tell you that the smart way of writing a book is to figure out the plot and then to figure out your characters. I am useless in that I always do the characters first and make my life really difficult to then have these characters and be like, well, now what are they going to do? I don't know. So I would, if you're a writer, I would suggest starting with your plot and then figuring out your characters. But for me, I am so inspired by characters and kind of quirks of characters that I just can't help but start there. And for both my books, Lost in the Neverwoods and Cemetery Boys, they're contemporary fantasy. So the magic is there, but it's not, a high fantasy setting. So it's like, so how do I incorporate this kind of magical secret into a world that I'm really familiar with? And for me, I think the funnest part and what I've done so far with these two books is I set them in a place that I am intimately familiar with. So Astoria, Oregon is a real place in Oregon, which is the state that I live in, a small coastal town. And East LA, I was born and raised in Oakland, California, and spent a lot of time in LA. So East LA is one of my favorite places in the world. So I just keep picking my favorite settings and going with that. But for the world building, I think what's really fun is just taking the ordinary and then making it extraordinary. That's my favorite kind of way of like world building, because with Cemetery Boys, it's a cemetery in the middle of East Los Angeles, but it has all these like secret hidden things. And same with Lost in the Neverwoods. It takes place in Astoria, but there's this huge forest and then dropped into the center of it. And that kind of becomes the epicenter for all of the magic that then unfolds in the story. So yeah, that's how I go about it. It's not the best way, but it's a way.
Well, now I'm feeling really validated because I am also useless and I always start with my characters. And then I have these characters and these wants and these desires and this, generalized plot. And then I'm like, okay, but like, where does this take place? So just like Aiden said, this is not recommended. I do not recommend it. My editor probably doesn't recommend it. My notebook's filled of bullet points and question marks, and this should probably be explained in some way. None of that backs up this method that I have, but unfortunately it is now mine. So
I've never related to someone so hard than writing this moment. I just have to say that.
It's so bad. But at the same time, then one of my favorite parts about world building is being like, okay, I know these characters in and out. I know exactly what they want. Now, how do I build a world that absolutely ruins their life? How do I just make this so difficult for them to get what they want? Because like, if this character wants to be the best witch in the world and the world really needs a best witch, like that's not an interesting story. But if like my character wants to be the best witch in the world and they're like, actually, you've ruined everything, you can never have that power, then we've built in a dynamic. And then from there, I can start to actually craft the thing that we all need, which is called a plot. So again, useless, do not recommend for others. Unfortunately, it is what I do.
Pro tip, if you want a successful book, don't listen to your editor. Right there. They said it, not me. Okay, well, let's keep going. Let's talk about magic, which it can honestly be defined quite broadly between subgenres of fantasy. And often in fantasy, there are magic systems. Some are critical to the plot, some are not, like Aiden Thomas just said. He just incorporated it to his world. So how do you negotiate the rules of magic in your work? If there's no magic system, why did you decide not to put it in? Or how did that came to be? So I'm going to go with Aiden Thomas for this one, since you just mentioned it.
Yeah, so what's really funny is that when the first book I ever wrote was actually Lost in the Neverwoods, not Cemetery Boys. Their release dates got flipped. So my first experience with an editor was Lost in the Neverwoods, and I remember like getting my first edit letter and then my editor being like, and let's jump on a phone call to like talk about some stuff. And I was just like, okay, we're going to talk about the book. And what it turned into was my editor was like, you don't have a magic system. There's no rules. You just do whatever you want. And that's not how books work. And I was like, what? I was like, I need rules. So she gave me homework, Holly West bless. And she was like, I want you to look this up and I want you to learn the differences between a soft magic system and a hard magic system. And I want you to figure out which one is going to fit your book and then act accordingly. So the theories of like a hard magic system versus a soft one. Soft magic system is like Lord of the Rings, where there's like magic and people like do things, but like we're not going to explain how or why that works. And then a hard magic system has these really strict rules, being like, this is the input, this is the output, this is the consequence. And so for me, I was like, can I do soft? And then she was like, no, you need to do hard. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah. The harder one is what I wanted to do anyways. So it was really being strategic, because like when I write magic, like I just want to like write vibes and like, you know, the beauty of it. I think that there's something really inherently beautiful about magic, whether it's, you know, evil magic or like good magic. And so it was really what it came down to was limiting it down to a scope that's easy to understand. And I think one of the funnest parts about developing and negotiating the rules of your magic system is to always have consequences. Like if you do this, like what are the consequences to it? And like Adrian mentioned earlier, that helps to like create a plot that totally like tears down your characters, and that's what makes a plot interesting for me personally. So that's usually how I go about it. First, I have to go back, reread what magic systems are, and then start figuring it out.
I kind of like to think of magic systems as sort of being like an additional character to the novel in a sense, because like when you're writing a character, you sort of understand like what is this person's limitation, what is like the absolute, like what is their strength. And so I think like by treating your magic system as having sort of the same like almost like personality as well, it can kind of help you find like a through line that you can actually weave it into your plot a little bit more, other than like, oh no, now I have to explain why this works. It's like, well, this happens because of this. Like if this happens, then that. And so I think that has been a really good way to keep myself on track, as we mentioned with the million bullet points and like, you should probably explain this. So treating my magic system almost as like an additional cast, like character in the cast has actually proven to be really useful for me. And like Aiden said, I think your magic should always have consequences, unless you're writing an entire book about why consequenceless worlds are their own thing, which is fascinating in its own. But I'm not that smart, so I need consequences to cut myself off at some point.
Yeah, like what I love about magic systems is that they're just as vast and varied as, you know, as the authors that create them. I really love magical systems that kind of lean on real world practices. A lot of the magic in this Poison Heart is based on root work and Black folk magic practices, which are things that kind of feel very, I think it feels very grounded in the real world, even though it's this kind of, you know, these kind of fantastical things that are occurring. It feels very real. And I think that's always kind of fun, especially if you know, come from a family where you have those older people who are, you know, as soon as you get sick, there's like potato slices in your socks or anointing oil on your forehead, or, you know, somebody always has a tea for something or a recipe for something. You know, I love it. Feels very kind of connected to family and to just kind of the everyday. And so, but you know, in fantasy worlds, there's always a question of, you know, who has magic, who has access to it, who doesn't, and why. And I think that all of those questions kind of lead to a very, you know, the potential for a very interesting plot. But I'm like, what do you really need a plot for? I'm just like, all vibes, no plot, magic, no rules, make it work. Like, let's just figure it out.
Yeah, for me, I've always struggled with developing a intricate magic system. I'm definitely more of a soft magic system person. Luckily, since the City Beautiful doesn't really have any sort of magic system in place, I really just draw from folklore. And I mean, it's relatively easy writing a ghostly possession, I'd say, compared to developing your own magic system. So I feel like when I'm trying to figure out how a magic system should work, it's really just dependent on the plot and what I need for the story. I'd say that my stories are more plot driven than character driven, and I try to develop the plot first. So I'm always thinking of how will the magic in the story affect the plot or affect the characters. But yeah, I definitely don't give magic systems that much thought until I'm later in the drafting process, I'd say. I love fairy tale logic, I will confess. I love just being able to throw magic in there and not questioning it. I think there's something very fun and refreshing about that, even if it's not quite as cleanly cut as a more of a hard magic system.
It's amazing that we have so much like variety, but everybody still thinks about it in terms of vibes. I love it. And just throwing stuff in there. Love it. Um, let's go. Let's keep moving. But when you're building your worlds, have you ever felt the pressure to create something fresh in a genre that is like so saturated, like it is fantasy? And if so, what are the tropes that you like lean on? And what are the things that set your world apart from the ones that have been done already? Or whatever, what are the vibes that set your world apart from what has been done already? And I'm gonna pass the word to Adrian for this one.
Ooh, okay. So this is like a really interesting question because I feel like we definitely hear that a lot of like, oh, the fantasy market is so oversaturated. Like, you know, here are a million different books that do the same thing that your book is doing. And it's like, I feel like a lot of the time we hear the term oversaturated when it means that a lot of like white cis het writers, couples stories have done that a lot, which is like all well and good. But to say something is oversaturated or something is done before other marginalized voices have had the chance to actually take those tropes, those themes, and put their own identities and their own stories with them just feels a little closed-minded to me. And so I like appreciate that question because I feel like it's something we hear all the time. But to that, I think that it's worth people pushing back and being like, hey, this actually isn't over until everyone's had their say. And so like, for me, like I love the one bed trope and like, I leaned into that with my book. I was like, I'm doing this. Everyone else has gotten to do it. I want this for my girls. And I did that. And like, for me, like there's nothing more fulfilling than reading a book where somebody has taken a trope that you've seen a million times and they take it and they make it their own again. So I'm very much of the idea that like nothing's done until we all say it's done.
Yeah, when I was querying Cinderella is Dead, I got told, by many agents that retellings were done and over. And I was like, well, where are the ones with the queer Black girls? And it wasn't over, it wasn't done. I center queer Black girls in my work, and I just wanted to see more of that in YA, especially in fantasy. I just wanted to see more. And I love tropes. I think they're great storytelling devices. And I think the reason I pick up so many retellings is because, I love how the same story can kind of become new again in the hands of authors who haven't had a chance to really make their voices heard in that space. And I want to see insta-love. I want to see, like Adrian was saying, I want to see, oh, there's only one bed. I want to see enemies to lovers. I want to see all of that. I want to see it with two queer Black girls. So, I think it's just, I think there's just so much, again, like Adrian was saying, it's oversaturated. We get told it's oversaturated, but it is this very straight, very white kind of story structure, and that's fine. You know, like ask me about my Twilight phase. Like I get it, it's totally fine. But you know, what about the Black vampires? Like I want to see them too. I mean, people say it's over and done with. It's not done. It's not over. We all deserve a chance to kind of lean into these storytelling devices and tell them in our own way. And you know, what do these stories and these tropes kind of look like when we decenter whiteness, when we decenter this kind of heteronormative gaze? You know, what do we get? And I think that we get something that is made new again.
Yeah, kind of just bouncing off what it's already been said, which has been amazing, is that the whole oversaturated idea is so ridiculous, especially considering how many fantasy stories that I personally want that are based around a culture. Like for Cemetery Boys, like the whole magic system has to do with Latinx culture, has to do with spiritual and religious practices and beliefs that my community has, and just kind of giving it a very literal output in the story. So I mean, we need more of those, because just like everyone said, it's very centered on cishet white, and to have these cultural fantasies they're the coolest books ever. So I mean, not just about mine, I mean like other books. Like there's so many good ones. I mean, I could look at my shelf right now and just name off a bunch. But the most important one for me personally was Labyrinth Lost by Zoraida Cordova. Like that, I had no idea that I could sell a book, or that publishing would want to buy a book that centered around like Latinx spiritualism or like magic, honestly. So that's, yeah, there's so much more room, and I want all of those stories so that I can consume them at a very fast rate. And when it comes to tropes, someone pointed this out to me recently, and it was very upsetting, because I was like, well, I don't know if I have like a trope that kind of crosses across my books. Maybe there's only one bed. But my friend was, I was like telling them about my books and an upcoming one actually, so I'm consistent if nothing else. And they're like, huh. And I was like, what? They're like, you really like writing romantic relationships that are kind of doomed from the start. And I was like, what? And they was like, well, you have, you know, a boy who falls in love with a ghost, and you have a girl who falls in love with a boy who belongs in this fantasy world. And I was like, okay, we don't have time to unpack all of that right now, but thank you so much for bringing it up. And now I'm going to stress out about that and think about it all the time. So yeah, that's a trope apparently that I'm into.
Yeah, for me, my greatest regret is not adding "there's only one bed" trope into The City Beautiful. Wish I did that. I love enemies to lovers tropes. I plan to do that eventually, and I feel like tropes are really fun to play around with. And I don't understand when people say they're, you know, overused or overdone. There's so much great material there. Yeah, for me, I try not to worry too much that that I'm going to be writing a story that someone else has already told, or there isn't a place in the market for my stories. I feel like there are so many stories out there that are similar, that have had multiple stories told, and that there's always room for more stories. There's always room for diverse stories, and it's just a matter of writing them, and of publishing being open to them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, enemies to lovers trope, I'm like, again, but then it's like queer. I'm like, okay, I'm listening. And it's so important to tell all of the stories because y'all get a unique perspective of it, right? So, for example, y'all pull from your own experiences to write those books. So we often hear, write what you know. Is there anything from your lives or your identities that inspire your books? And if so, why was it so important for you to have that in your stories? And I'm gonna go with Aiden Polidorus with this one.
Yeah, well, in The City Beautiful, it draws heavily from Jewish folklore, and the main character, all of the main characters are Jewish. And when I was working on it, it was just really important for me to write that. I began writing it after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, when I realized that there really needs to be more genre fiction with Jewish characters, that Jewish teens can see themselves as the heroes. Because growing up, the only books I read with Jewish characters, probably until my 20s, was Holocaust fiction. And I think that there's so much more history to draw from, and that I knew I wanted to write a story where the Jewish characters weren't just passive victims. So yeah, I'd say that the feelings Altair, the main character, has regarding his religion, regarding fitting in, and also some of his experiences with anti-Semitism come from my own experiences. And I also tried to write him as someone who's struggling with anxiety and depression, because those had a huge impact on my life. And although I don't exactly state it in the book, I do hope that readers who may be struggling with those will see themselves.
Yeah, my book has a lot of feelings in it, which is drawn directly from my real life, which is filled with a lot of feelings. So like just like Aiden said, in Sweet and Bitter Magic, Tamsin, one of the point of view characters, she has this curse where she's cursed not to ever feel any type of love. So she can't, feel the love of family. She can't love a sunset. She can't feel the joy that comes from loving a pet. Like, there's just this cold gray bleakness. And that is absolutely a direct reflection of some of my own personal mental health struggles and experiences. And, Ren, my other point of view character, is overly earnest and therefore very anxious, and that is also another part of myself. And so that was really important to me to include in this book, because I think that when I was a teenager, there just really wasn't that same sort of mental health representation. And so I was like, am I wrong? Am I broken? Am I dying? And I didn't know. And so if I can, offer anyone okay, someone else feels this way too, that's a huge win for me. And then, not to get really sappy here, but also like in terms of writing sapphic fiction, my wife likes to say that I'm writing all of the books that she wished that she had at 16. And like, that's so important for me too. So that is a very conscious decision. All of my books will be queer.
So for me, it's really funny because with both of my books, Lost in the Neverwoods and Cemetery Boys, I get people, mostly readers, who will be like, how did you go about researching like either the mental health issues that Wendy has, or the Latinx magic or brujeria in Cemetery Boys? And it, like, every time I'm just like, well, I didn't really research it because it was like my lived experience. Like, I understand that these books are fantasies, but for Cemetery Boys, like I mentioned earlier, I just took our belief systems and gave them a very literal output. Day of the Dead is my favorite holiday in the world. So once I kind of came up with this like ghost story idea, I was like, oh my gosh, it has to be about Dia de Muertos. And I'm going to write about all my favorite things about the holiday, all the food, the decorations, just everything. So that comes from a very personal, dear part in my heart personally. And then in Lost in the Neverwoods, I actually just got a message recently from a reader who was like, my partner read your book and was so blown away by how accurately Wendy's PTSD was represented and dealt with. And they're like, what did you do to like research this? And I was like, I haven't responded yet because it's just like, well, I have PTSD. And so that's how I was able to authentically write Wendy and to really be in touch with what she's going through. And honestly, the hardest part about being a writer is that you have these thoughts and these feelings, and then translating them into words so that you can share those with others is the hardest part. And I have very deep connections to what both these characters are going through. And that's how I'm able to not perfectly translate it, but translate it pretty well onto the page. So, yeah.
I think a lot of the things that are kind of going on around me and my own personal feelings make it into the work. I can't, I don't know that I'm always doing it consciously. It just kind of ends up there. Sometimes I wrote the first draft of Cinderella's Dead in 2016. It was an election year. And I was already writing this story where, essentially a piece of propaganda becomes the backbone of this society. And I kind of was watching that play out in real time. And so the story evolved just because of what was going on there. But at its heart, that story was a story that I would have wanted to see when I was 15 or 16. I wish that I had just had a story that where I could have seen a bigger kind of piece of myself. And with This Poison Heart, what's fun about this book is that I find myself kind of focusing on the family and looking into this YA where I'm much more like the parents of my main characters than I am like the main characters themselves. And especially Bree's parents. I am mom, if anybody needs to know that. Like if you're reading that book, her mom, she is me, I am her. That is, there's so much of myself in that character to the point where like I let my oldest daughter read it. And she was like, why'd you put yourself in this book? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And she was like, yeah, this is you. And it's a pretty accurate representation. So that's kind of fun. But I just really want my readers to be seen, and I want them to know that I see them and that they are valid, and that even if you're the chosen one, I'm still going to need you to take your phone and have it charged and maybe put your location on if you're going too far. So I just kind of want my readers to have that kind of connection to me and to who I am as a person. And that's always a kind of a fun way to connect with my readers.
I am not crying. Y'all are. I'm just kidding. I love how most of y'all said this. I wish I had this, or I'm writing what I wish I had. And it's so important in terms of representation. And until very recently, queer characters barely existed in fantasy, right? They only existed in subtext. A lot were queer coded. We were like grabbing the crumbs that we could get. But all of the books that y'all are writing are groundbreaking because y'all are writing unapologetically queer characters. So how do you negotiate queerness in your writing? And was it a decision to write queer stories and characters? I know Adrienne mentioned that everything she's writing now is gonna be sapphic. So if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's incredibly intentional, incredibly purposeful. The stories that I'm crafting, I think, are almost inherently even narratively sapphic because I'm making a conscious decision that these are the stories I'm telling, these are the characters that I want to build. This is the type of writer I want to be, so people know what they can expect from a book. If I'm writing it, that they will be able to, find these particular thoughts and feelings and types of hearts and relationships. And I think, I'm getting like emotional, but it's really special that I have somehow managed to be publishing right now with like the people on this panel. Even like, I'm just like genuinely so humbled because like the work that's coming out right now and just the walls that we're tearing down and pushing forward and the work that's being done is just, it's extraordinary. And there's no other word for that. And it feels like a really exciting time to be in publishing. Like I said, I'm so humbled and honored to be a part of it, of creating intentional queer fantasy and fiction. So like, thank you all, not to get really sappy.
So like I mentioned earlier, Lost in the Neverwoods is actually the first book that I wrote. Cemetery Boys was the second book, my option book. And Lost in the Neverwoods is a book that has a mostly white cast. It has, the main character she's cis and straight. It's not talked about, basically. Same thing goes for Peter, the love interest. And it's interesting because I wrote that. It's the first book I ever wrote, and I wrote it because I had been told by media that writing about queer stories, let alone trans stories, or about characters of color, so Latinx characters, wasn't sellable. It wasn't something that publishing wanted. It wasn't something that anyone wanted. I didn't see myself in media, books, TV shows, movies at all. I still haven't really. Like, maybe there's some parts of or aspects of my identity, but not all of it. And it's interesting because it was the first book that I sold. And because I sold that book, I was able to bring Cemetery Boys into the world. And that's a huge and important thing for me. And when we decided to flip the dates, I was really worried because I thought readers would be disappointed or angry at me for, having my second book not have all this really beautiful representation that they had loved so much about Cemetery Boys. And those nightmares did come true. There were a lot of people who were very upset with me. But this Lost in the Woods has a very dear place, an important place in my heart. And it's because I believe, started my career with a book that was more palatable to publishing executives. I was able to bring in, kind of sneak in is how I feel, this really queer trans Latinx book. And I will forever be grateful for Lost in the Woods for doing that for me. And it was life-changing to be able to have the space to write a book about queerness and about transness and about Latinx identity. And from now on, I sure as heck, just like Adrienne said, all my stuff's going to be queer as hell. But I'm always going to love Lost in the Woods for giving me this opportunity, for giving me this platform, because without it, I wouldn't be here. And it's so, negotiating queerness in my writing, it's just I want to shove as much of it into my books now as possible. My next project is going to be a duology that's Percy Jackson meets the Hunger Games, and there's a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, or gender neutral gods, and there's trans gods, and there's trans demigods, and there's asexual demigods. So I'm just I'm really the straight cis is going to be the minority in all my stories going forward, and I'm very excited about that. And yeah, it's freeing and it's very exciting.
Aiden, I'm gonna need that in my inbox. I'm gonna need it.
Look, as soon as
I'm here.
legible,
If you need anything, if you need anybody to look at it, just let me know.
I will keep that in mind.
Yeah. Cinderella was the fourth novel that I wrote, and the other books that I wrote were what I thought I needed to write to be published. And they were also the books that I wrote when I followed the advice of my teachers and my writing workshop instructors. And it's this kind of erasure is so insidious. It exists on so many levels that people are telling you in workshop, in critique groups, you can't, if you write that story, you're not going to be able to get it published. Nobody wants to read that. And I think I internalized some of that. And so I wrote several books that were just very, straight white characters. And, even if you've read a lot of YA in the past, several years, you might think that that's the only way that you could get published. Right before I sat down to write Cinderella, I was kind of at a point where I felt like, okay, this isn't working and I'm not happy. And, I was not feeling fulfilled, as kind of cliche as that sounds, as a writer. I was writing these stories and it just didn't feel okay to me. And so I said to myself, I'm going to write the book that I want to write. I'm going to set aside anything that doesn't serve me while I'm writing it. And I'm going to center a queer Black girl because that's what I wanted. That's what I've been wanting to read and wanting to write for so long. And I told myself I was going to give my queer characters room to be exactly who they are. And when I kind of allowed myself the grace to kind of write the thing that was closest to my heart, I wrote Cinderella is Dead. And I think that kind of proved to me that the story was worth telling, and that there were other ways of getting these stories, especially, YA fantasy, out there, and that there were readers who are waiting for these type of stories. I think that is also something I think about a lot. And so, yeah, I don't feel the need to write stories that don't speak to me and that don't serve me in the way that I need them to. And there are plenty of straight white stories out there. You are not going to be missing. Like, it's totally fine. You got plenty of options there. So I think it's okay for me to continue to center queer Black girls in my work. And I have Sophia and Constance and Erin and Liv in this first Cinderella's Dead, and then this Poison Heart. It's like there are so many queer Black women that it's like I've lost count. And so I love that. And I'm going to continue to do that.
Yeah, for me, the first book that I published, Project Pandora, was with a smaller press. And I felt as when I was writing it, I didn't think that there was a place in publishing for genre fiction with queer characters. So although I would have loved to have the characters be gay, I made them all straight, and that's one of my regrets. And looking back, I feel like that I wrote the kind of book that I thought would sell, but it wasn't exactly the kind of book I was happy with. And with The City Beautiful, I gave myself much more leeway, even though as I was writing it, I had a feeling, okay, nobody's going to want to read this book. Not only because the main character is gay, but also because he's Jewish and he's observant, which I thought that's not going to be appealing to readers. Who's going to want to read that, especially if it's a gothic horror story? But I feel like as soon as I started writing that, and as soon as I realized, okay, this book may not sell, but it's still a good story, it felt so freeing. And it's probably it's been the best story I've written yet. And I feel like part of that has to do with the fact that that I stopped thinking about if it's marketable. I stopped telling myself nobody's going to want to read this, and I just allowed myself to enjoy the story and enjoy just writing characters that I wanted to see represented in fiction.
It's incredible to me that y'all say that no one wants to read it because there's such a big, well, like y'all thought that no one wanted to read that because we've made so many like huge strides when it comes to publishing. And kind of like a continuation from this question and what we just talked about, I know that we've made so much progress, but even still in mainstream literature has often been more accepting of white, cisgender, gay male characters. And in the fantasy genre, we always alluded to queerness, and there's always been like crumbs and things that we can grab. But it still feels like there's a stigma specifically against sapphic fantasy and non-white fantasy. So do you think there's a stigma? And if so, how can writers push back against that? And whoever wants to take the baton on this one.
There is a stigma. It exists. And we have made strides in publishing, but I don't think that I don't think that we're anywhere near where we should be, where we need to be. I think that, as a writer, I'm pushing back against the stigma by continuing to center queer girls in my work. I think there's a very specific kind of thought process as it relates to queer Black women. There's misogyny there, but there's also racism. And so I think what we need more than anything is because the authors are here. We're creating the work. We're here. We've been here. What we really need is the support of publishing. And I think that, we need the marketing budgets. We need the advances. We need the kind of overall support that, from publishing that helps us avoid that cycle of, a queer book gets acquired, but then it doesn't get the support that it needs. And so it doesn't sell well. And then it's used as an example to say, see, it didn't sell well. And it's kind of like this self-fulfilling prophecy that publishing sometimes participates in. And, I think that queer books have, they hit lists, they earn out, they are profitable when they have the support that they need. And the readership is there. And, I don't like that we have to prove our worth like that, because I see people with no platform write a book about a middle-aged man who gets a divorce and starts dating his child's babysitter and get a six-figure advance for one book. And it's like, did that person have to prove it? I don't know. I don't think so. It feels like we're being asked to do that. And I don't necessarily like that, but we did prove it. We have proved it. And so now what? We've shown that these books are profitable. And so what do we do now? We really need that support from publishing on a bigger level. We deserve that. And so there are still issues that we are dealing with. There's still pushback. But I think that it's moving in the right direction. But we need publishing as a whole to get on board, jump in with both feet, and really, really support us the way we deserve to be supported.
I have very little to add to that other than just my very enthusiastic support for everything that Caitlin said. She's exactly right. The stories are there, the authors are there, the writers are there. Is publishing there? That's the question that still feels a little unanswered. The readers are there, the support, like we have all of that. We have those numbers, we have that proof. Queer books do sell, especially when they're given a proper marketing budget, especially when the authors are given enough of an advance that allows them to have maybe only 2 jobs or maybe even just 1 job that is writing. But the fact that I think especially writers who are more marginalized are working so much harder on so many other things as well as these books, because you're not getting that kind of advanced support monetarily. You're not getting that advanced support from like a big push of like, hey, like let's all band behind this and go. So we're not just looking at like a lack of support in like one sense. It's feels a little bit bigger than that. And all that I can hope is that we continue to write these stories and publishing continues to acquire them and really give them the time and the attention that they deserve so that we can just keep moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with wholeheartedly with everything both of you have said. I don't really think I have anything to add to that. I think it's really a matter of publishing getting behind it and giving sapphic writers the support and the marketing they deserve.
I think the best way to push back against stigmas is to flip the market with books that kind of center whatever publishing is trying to like push back against, especially when it comes to sapphic fantasy. I think the more writers write those kinds of books and then other authors and readers hype those books, that's the best way to push back against kind of this shutting out within the industry. So that's why book bloggers and vloggers and YouTubes and TikTokers are so important, because it's really just their voices and getting out in front of an audience and putting those books like in the forefront is how we can kind of fight against that, and also to encourage and support the writers in those sorts of books.
Well, we touched on the publishing part of things, which is kind of disappointing at times, but there is writers that want to get into the genre and they want to write their own story. So what advice would you give them for young queer fantasy writers who may worry about incorporating queerness into their books. And now that y'all can talk about, your own experiences doing that, because we've touched a little on it, but like more in a specific and advice that you would give them.
I guess I would say my advice is, if they're worried about, does this queerness fit into the publishing world as a whole? Does this queerness fit into this story? Like, I think what it comes down to, and I think what we've heard a little bit on this panel today, is that as soon as you write the stories that you're feeling, the stories that are truly in your heart, that's when your best work is done. And so I would advise people to stop self-editing so soon in the process. Let yourself put your heart on a page. You can pull it back later, but if you don't let yourself go there, your stories are always going to be missing that little special something that makes a book just truly, truly extraordinary. So especially for, queer writers, make your fantasy queer, do it. Like, let your heart be on that page, let yourself be a part of this genre. It's scary sometimes, but it's also really, really rewarding.
Yeah. I would say that I understand, why you would be worried, and I don't want to minimize those feelings at all. It's definitely a challenge. But you are not alone. There's a community here who knows exactly what that feels like. And I think more than anything, what I would say is that your stories matter, and that there are readers out there right now who are waiting for a story just like yours, because queer people are not a monolith. There are, queerness is vast and varied, and there are so many stories to tell, and yours matters and it counts. And there are challenges in publishing like there are in any other setting, but your stories are important and we need them. And you just have to kind of write the story that you want to write, and understand that we're kind of in the process right now of unmaking the rules that have kind of constrained publishing for so long. And so it feels equal parts exciting and scary, because we're all in this and watching things kind of start to change. And it's been a long time coming. But I would say that I understand those feelings. But, if you have a story to tell, you should tell it, and you should tell it the way that is, in your heart to tell it.
I would probably tell them just trust that your story has a place in the world, and that there are people out there who want to read it, who need it. I feel like it's so important for queer writers to keep producing work, to get their stories out there. And we have no control over how publishing receives our stories. So I'd say just keep writing, and even if you face rejection at first, don't let that affect how you view your work. Don't make that into don't God, I've lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. I'd say if you get rejection, do not tell yourself that's because your work is queer. And don't let yourself believe that your work has no value because it's queer. It has a place in the industry, and it deserves to be seen. And there's going to be so many people who are going to gain so much from your work.
So advice that I would give to young queer fantasy writers who might be worried about incorporating queerness into their stories is to do it anyways. I feel like I just keep repeating myself and being like, flood the market, keep writing the books. But it's like having that community support of other writers and readers that really helps kind of harness those connections and makes it feel like it's a lot less scary. So if you have people who are like hyping you up, even in just like the writing stage of it, that encouragement is really important, and it kind of starts creating those safe spaces where people feel like they can actually write about those books of their heart, if it's like queerness and fantasy books or any kind of queer books in general. yeah, so creating community where we really uplift and support those voices and those stories is so important.
Definitely. And this part that you said, there's so many people that are going to gain so much from your work. What is the most important thing that you want your readers to take away from your work or your writing?
I guess I want my characters and my stories to humanize Jewish characters a bit more and queer characters a bit more. And I feel like by writing marginalized characters, that can help breed empathy and breed understanding. And I guess that's really just what I want for my work. I want queer and Jewish readers to be able to see themselves represented, but I also want to sort of counter the stereotypes that we so often see and show that that queer and Jewish people aren't monoliths. That we all have our unique experiences, and I'm hoping that possibly through my writing, I can counter some of the stereotypes that I so often see.
I hope that readers are able to find a place for themselves in my book and find a minute to take a deep breath or take a load off, or, find a minute of escapism in a fantasy world without homophobia, where their queerness can just exist, where there's no struggle in that sense, and that they can be the stars of a story and just live as a queer person without continually having to justify or defend their existence in any way, that the adventure is about what they do, not necessarily just who they are at all times. And I hope that my books give people a soft place to land here and there.
I hope that my readers see that, even on your worst day, you are worthy of love and respect. I just want readers to have another choice. I just want you to have another option when it comes to YA fantasy, YA fiction in general. I want readers to know that, there are lots of queer stories across different genres, and that, in those stories, you can be anything. You can be the hero. You can be the chosen one. You can slay dragons and, find out you're the heir to a kingdom. You can do all of those things, and you can do and be all of those things within stories. And I hope that will kind of inspire people to shoot for the moon in their real life as well. I think that's the magic of storytelling. And I just feel really honored to get to do this work.
I think the most important thing that I want readers to take away from my stories is to find a sense of connection. When I was growing up, I felt very isolated, especially as a queer closeted person. And I think if I had more books to read where I could see myself represented, it would make that feel a lot less lonely. I think when we're teenagers and we're growing up, oftentimes the people that we connect with the most are the ones who are in closest proximity. So it's not really like people in our direct families, but it's people who we meet on the internet, or vloggers, like trans vloggers. That was the first time I ever saw myself represented in anything other than my own head. And so kind of finding that community base is really important. And so I hope that my books can kind of be that source of comfort and recognition for readers to kind of see themselves and to feel really loved and supported and seen and appreciated for exactly who they are.
Once again, I'm not crying. But thank you so much for this incredible conversation. Where can readers find more information about you and your work?
Okay. I was like, who's I'm at Kaylin Bayron on the Twitter and Instagram. I'm also at KaylinBayron.com. And my books are available. Cinderella's Dead is available everywhere books are sold. And This Poison Heart comes out June 29th and is up for pre-order right now. And there's a pre-order campaign. So please, pre-order and sign up for the pre-order campaign and get a pin. And there's a bunch of fun stuff coming up for this book, a bunch of fun promo stuff. So I'm really excited about that.
You can find me at Adrienne Tooley on Instagram and Twitter, adriennetooley.com. Sweet and Bitter Magic is in stores. It's my little plague book that came out during a pandemic. Terrible timing. We love to see it.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Aidan Polydorus, and also aidanpolidorus.com. Unfortunately, I don't have my book in front of me. I really wish I did. But it comes out September 7th, and I also have a pre-order campaign, beautiful character cards. So keep an eye out for that.
And we lost Aidan Thomas to internet problems, but Cemetery Boys and Lost in the Neverwood. Now, I'm Monte Castro, and thank you, Kaylin Barron, Adrienne Tooley, Aidan Polydorus, and Aidan Thomas for joining us at Pride Book Fest 2021.